September 11th, 1851. The quiet fields of Christiana, Pennsylvania, woke not to the sound of roosters but to the pounding of fists on a farmhouse door. Outside stood armed men, slave catchers from Maryland, led by a wealthy planter determined to reclaim what he called his property. Inside were the men they hunted, formerly enslaved Africans who had escaped across the Mason-Dixon line, believing they had finally found freedom in the North. But this would not be another silent capture in the dead of night. This time, the hunted were not alone. The house was surrounded by neighbors, black farmers, fugitives, and white abolitionists, ready to defend their community with muskets, pitchforks, and sheer defiance. What followed would shock the nation. Shouts turned into gunfire, smoke and blood filled the air. By the end of the clash, one of the slave catchers lay dead, his son bleeding, and the myth of safe slavery shattered. The newspapers called it a riot. Southerners called it treason. But for those who stood in that farmhouse, it was something else entirely: resistance. The Christiana Resistance was not a battle between armies, but between two visions of America, one that demanded chains and one that demanded freedom. And though the fight lasted only minutes, its echoes would thunder across the country, fueling the fire that would explode into the Civil War. This is not just the story of fugitives on the run. This is the story of the day a small town in Pennsylvania became a battlefield for America's soul. To understand why the Christiana Resistance erupted in gunfire, we must begin a year earlier in the halls of Congress. In 1850, America was on fire, not yet with muskets and cannons, but with words, compromises, and threats of secession. The nation was split between North and South, between free states and slave states, and every new territory carved from the West seemed to sharpen the blade dividing them. In a desperate attempt to hold the Union together, Congress passed what became known as the Compromise of 1850. Buried inside was a law so brutal, so unforgiving, that it made freedom itself a fragile illusion: the Fugitive Slave Act. The law decreed that no black person was truly safe anywhere in America. Even if they had crossed the Mason-Dixon line, even if they lived for years in free states like Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, even if they had families, farms, or churches, if a white man claimed them as a runaway, they could be seized. No jury, no defense. A single commissioner could send them back to bondage with the stroke of a pen. And the law went further. It demanded that ordinary citizens, neighbors, shopkeepers, even strangers on the street, help capture alleged runaways. Refusing to assist was itself a crime. In effect, the Fugitive Slave Act turned the entire North into hunting ground, deputizing every American as a potential slave catcher. The impact was immediate and terrifying. Armed posses from the South rode into northern towns, snatching men and women off the streets. Families that thought themselves free fled deeper into Canada, chased by the long reach of the law. Newspapers blazed with outrage. Some Northerners bowed to the law, others swore to defy it. And nowhere was the tension sharper than in Pennsylvania, a border state where freedom and slavery were separated by a single invisible line. In towns like Christiana, where free black communities had taken root and fugitives from Maryland sought refuge, the Fugitive Slave Act was more than words on paper. It was a daily threat, a ticking clock that could explode at any moment. When Edward Gorsuch, a wealthy slaveholder from Maryland, rode north in 1851 with his son and a band of armed men, he believed he carried the law on his side. He believed he had the power of Congress, the courts, and the Fugitive Slave Act behind him. What he did not know was that the people of Christiana had already decided, law or no law, they would not go quietly. Christiana was not a city of grand avenues or marble halls. It was a modest farming community in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, rolling fields, barns weathered by the seasons, and dirt roads winding through quiet countryside. To an outsider, it looked ordinary, even sleepy. But for those who fled slavery, Christiana was more than a town. It was a lifeline. By the mid-19th century, Christiana had become a crucial stop along the Underground Railroad, the secret network of safe houses, churches, and allies that stretched from the South to freedom in the North and Canada. Conductors guided fugitives by night, hiding them in wagons, barns, and cellars, while station masters, both black and white, risked prison and fines to offer food, shelter, and new directions. The Fugitive Slave Act, made helping a runaway punishable by law, but Christiana's people did not bend easily. The town's geography worked in their favor, close enough to the Mason-Dixon line that fugitives could reach it after only a few days of flight, but far enough inside Pennsylvania that patrols from Maryland could not simply raid at will. For the enslaved escaping across the border, Christiana was often the first place where the chains felt truly broken. At the heart of this refuge were free black farmers, men and women who had carved out lives of dignity in a nation that sought to deny them equality. Some were the children of the formerly enslaved, others had themselves escaped bondage. They tilled their land, built homes, raised families, and became anchors of hope for those still on the run. Their farms doubled as sanctuaries, where weary fugitives could rest and recover before moving further north. One of the most important figures was William Parker, a formerly enslaved man from Maryland who had escaped as a teenager. In Christiana, he became a leader, not just in farming but in organizing defense. Parker believed that freedom meant more than escape. It meant the courage to fight back. He and his allies formed a mutual protection society, pledging to defend one another against slave catchers. They trained, shared information, and kept watch over the countryside like soldiers of a hidden army. Christiana's black community did not stand alone. White abolitionists, Quakers, radical activists, and ordinary neighbors offered quiet support. Some harbored fugitives in their barns, others provided food or legal counsel. The town became a rare place where interracial cooperation was not only preached but lived, bound by the shared conviction that slavery was an evil too monstrous to tolerate. Yet, this defiance made Christiana a target. Maryland planters knew the town's reputation. They grumbled that too many of their runaways seemed to vanish into its farms and barns. Newspapers in Baltimore and Philadelphia carried angry reports, painting Christiana as a nest of lawbreakers. When the Fugitive Slave Act gave slaveholders the right to pursue fugitives into free states, Christiana rose to the top of their lists. So when Edward Gorsuch traced his lost property to the outskirts of Christiana in 1851, he was not entering neutral ground. He was walking into a community that had already drawn its line in the sand, a community that would choose blood over bondage. Edward Gorsuch was not the image of a reckless desperado. He was a Maryland planter, a man of property, of standing, of quiet conviction. He believed in order, in discipline, and above all, in the sanctity of his rights as a slaveholder. For decades, he had raised crops with the labor of enslaved Africans, and he had no doubt that the law, human and divine, was on his side. But in 1849, several of Gorsuch's enslaved men fled his plantation in Baltimore County. They crossed the Mason-Dixon line, vanishing into Pennsylvania, where whispers spoke of safe houses and abolitionist allies. To Gorsuch, it was not only a financial loss, it was a personal affront, a wound to his pride. He was a man who believed in obedience, and their escape was, to him, nothing short of betrayal. For 2 years, Gorsuch pursued them through rumor and report, sending word to contacts following scraps of information. Then came the breakthrough. He learned that at least some of the fugitives had taken refuge near a small town in Lancaster County, Christiana. By 1851, the timing seemed perfect. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had given him unprecedented power. Where once northern states had shielded runaways, now the federal government demanded their return. Commissioners could issue warrants, marshals could be deputized, and any citizen who resisted could be fined or imprisoned. To Gorsuch, the law was a sword sharpened for men like him. He wasted no time. With legal papers in hand, he gathered a posse. His son Dickinson, his nephew, and a group of federal marshals. They armed themselves, not only with warrants, but with pistols and muskets. Their mission was clear: ride into Pennsylvania, seize the fugitives, and bring them back to Maryland in chains. In Baltimore, friends and fellow planters wished him luck. To them, his expedition was righteous, even noble, a man enforcing the law of the land, defending the sacred right of property. But others, more cautious, warned him of Pennsylvania's defiance. The people there are restless, some said. They will not bow easily. Gorsuch dismissed such talk. He had the law on his side. He had federal power behind him. What could a handful of fugitives and farmers do against the might of the United States? The journey north was not long, but it was heavy with symbolism. Each mile carried Gorsuch deeper into enemy ground, a land where the soil itself seemed to reject slavery, where Quakers preached equality and black farmers tilled land of their own. To him, Pennsylvania was a rebellious neighbor, a state that had forgotten its obligations to the Union. But he would remind them. He would make an example. On the night of September 10th, Gorsuch's party reached the outskirts of Christiana. They moved quietly, their papers folded, their weapons ready. The plan was simple: strike at dawn, surround the farmhouse where the fugitives were said to hide, and take them swiftly before the town could rally. But Christiana was not asleep. Behind those quiet barns and fields, a network of eyes and ears was already alert. Word of slave catchers traveled faster than Gorsuch realized. By the time his boots touched the soil of Lancaster County, the town knew he was coming. And in the pre-dawn hours of September 11th, Edward Gorsuch would discover that law and power meant little when a community had already decided it would rather die than surrender. The morning of September 11th, 1851, was still dark when Edward Gorsuch and his party approached the small farmhouse belonging to William Parker. Mist hung over the fields, the air thick with silence, broken only by the crunch of boots and the creak of wagon wheels. To Gorsuch, this was the moment of restoration, the morning he would reclaim what was his. They surrounded the house quietly, federal warrants ready, muskets in hand. But the silence did not last. A voice from inside, firm, unyielding, called out, "Who are you, and what do you want?" The posse answered with authority. They were there to arrest fugitives, to seize men who belonged to Gorsuch. They expected obedience. They expected fear. Instead, the reply was defiance. Inside the house stood William Parker and several black men, some fugitives, others free, all prepared to fight. They had been warned hours earlier that slave catchers were on the move. Parker's wife, Eliza, and others carried messages through the night, alerting neighbors. By dawn, the farmhouse was not alone. Black farmers from around Christiana were slipping into the yard, muskets over their shoulders, scythes and axes in hand. Women and children kept watch from windows and fences, shouting warnings when they saw strangers approach. The standoff grew tense. Gorsuch stepped forward, voice hard but calm, reading the warrant aloud. He promised protection for those who surrendered, punishment for those who resisted. He believed the law was shield enough. William Parker answered coldly, "We will not be taken. We have as much right to be free as you have to enslave." It was a line in the sand. Minutes stretched like hours. Gorsuch tried persuasion, then threats. He ordered his men closer. His son Dickinson raised his weapon. But the yard was swelling. Dozens of black farmers and fugitives now stood together, their eyes fixed, their hands steady. They were outnumbered, yes, but not outmatched. The law on paper meant little when every fence post, every tree, every barn door hid men and women ready to resist. Shouts rang out, a musket cracked. Whether it was warning or intent, it shattered the standoff. Chaos erupted. Smoke filled the air as both sides fired. Dickinson Gorsuch fell, bleeding from a shot, while his father staggered back in shock. The posse, expecting submission, found themselves under siege. Women hurled stones and boiling water from windows. Men rushed forward with axes, clubs, and blades. The federal marshals fired wildly, retreating against the sheer ferocity of the defense. And in the center of it all, Edward Gorsuch himself refused to retreat. He stood firm, shouting for his property, calling his men cowards as he advanced. But the tide had turned. Surrounded, wounded, and unyielding, he fell beneath the blows and bullets of those he had come to enslave. The fight lasted only minutes, but it felt like eternity. By the time the smoke cleared, Edward Gorsuch lay dead in the yard. His son, bleeding but alive, was dragged away by allies. The marshals stumbled back down the road, retreating to Baltimore with tales of horror. Christiana, for a brief moment, was free ground defended by its own people. No banner was raised, no proclamation written. But in those minutes of defiance, the law of slavery had been broken, not in Congress, not in courts, but in a Pennsylvania field by farmers, fugitives, and neighbors who had decided that enough was enough. News of the clash raced across the North and South. In Baltimore, they called it murder. In Christiana, they called it survival. And in the eyes of history, it became something larger, a rebellion, not of armies, but of community, a moment when the hunted turned and fought. When the gun smoke lifted over Christiana and Edward Gorsuch lay dead, silence fell heavy on the fields. But it was not peace. The echoes of musket fire carried far beyond the farmhouse, rippling into courthouses, newspapers, and the halls of Congress. What had begun as a skirmish in a quiet Pennsylvania town was about to ignite a storm across the nation. Within hours, word of the Christiana riot raced south to Baltimore. There, planters and politicians reacted with fury. To them, this was no mere murder. It was treason. A slaveholder, armed with federal warrants, had been killed while enforcing the law of the United States. If the Union could not protect its property, then what good was the Union at all? Federal marshals and local militias descended on Christiana. Farms were raided, homes searched, and dozens of men dragged away in chains. Black farmers, free men of color, fugitives, and even white abolitionists were accused of conspiracy. The authorities wanted not just vengeance, but an example. They would prove that defying the Fugitive Slave Act carried the gravest of consequences. The trials that followed were nothing short of historic. 38 men were indicted, not just for murder, but for treason against the United States, a charge so weighty that it had rarely been invoked outside of rebellion. The government sought to make Christiana a warning. Any community that dared to resist slave catchers would face the full power of the Union. The first man brought to trial was Castner Hanway, a white miller and known abolitionist. He had been present at the clash but had refused to aid the slave catchers. The prosecution argued that his refusal, his sympathy with fugitives, and his alleged encouragement of resistance made him guilty of treason itself. If they could convict Hanway, a white man of good standing, the message would be unmistakable. No one was above the law of slavery. The trial began in November 1851 in Philadelphia, and the courtroom became a national stage. Reporters crowded the benches, lawyers thundered arguments, federal prosecutors demanded the harshest penalty, while defense attorneys countered that resistance to injustice could never be treason. Outside the courtroom, tension boiled. Abolitionists rallied to the defense of the accused, raising funds and spreading pamphlets. Pro-slavery voices howled for blood, demanding that Pennsylvania bow to the Fugitive Slave Act. The trial became more than a question of guilt or innocence. It was a referendum on the soul of the nation. And then, in December, the verdict came. After weeks of testimony and rhetoric, the jury acquitted Hanway. The government's case collapsed. Without his conviction, the other charges of treason crumbled. One by one, the defendants were released. The reaction was explosive. In the South, outrage burned. Newspapers denounced the jury, calling the trial proof that the North would never enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. Politicians warned that the Union itself was in peril if slaveholders' rights could not be protected. In the North, however, the verdict was celebrated. Abolitionist papers proclaimed it a victory for justice, a sign that communities could resist tyranny and win. But the deeper truth was more complex. Though the defendants walked free, Christiana remained scarred. Families had been torn apart by arrests. William Parker himself, the man at the center of the clash, was forced to flee. First into hiding, then into exile in Canada, never to return. For him and many others, the price of resistance was permanent displacement. Yet the Christiana resistance could not be erased. It lingered in speeches, in sermons, in the debates of Congress. Southerners invoked it as proof that Northern abolitionists were lawless radicals undermining the Union. Northerners invoked it as proof that slavery was irreconcilable with freedom, and that the Fugitive Slave Act was a weapon of tyranny. Above all, Christiana revealed a chilling reality. The Union was splitting along lines that no compromise could mend. If one town in Pennsylvania could defy the law of the land and walk away acquitted, then perhaps the Union itself was already fractured. In the years that followed, the Christiana riot lived on in memory, but what people remembered depended on where they stood. To the South, it was a chilling omen, a symbol that the North could not be trusted, that abolitionist sentiment was poisoning the nation's ability to uphold law and order. To the North, it became a spark of hope, proof that communities could resist injustice and survive. The Southern narrative was one of betrayal. Newspapers in Maryland and Virginia thundered with rage, calling Christiana an act of war. Slaveholders insisted that the Fugitive Slave Act meant nothing if Northerners would not enforce it. They pointed to the acquittals as evidence that juries in free states would never punish resistance to slavery. Every planter who read about Edward Gorsuch's death imagined himself in the same position, crossing into the North to reclaim what the law called his property, only to be met with violence and defiance. To them, the Christiana Resistance was not just murder, it was rebellion. For the North, Christiana was something else entirely. Abolitionist newspapers framed it as an act of righteous defense, a moment when ordinary men and women, black and white, stood together against tyranny. The story was retold in sermons, lectures, and pamphlets. William Parker, writing later from Canada, recounted the courage of his community and the injustice of the law they resisted. His narrative made its way into abolitionist circles, a living testimony that the enslaved were not passive victims but determined fighters for freedom. The verdicts in Philadelphia sent a clear message. Juries in the North were increasingly unwilling to punish those who defied the Fugitive Slave Act. While the law remained on the books, its enforcement became fragile. Slave catchers still roamed the North, but their task grew harder, their fear greater. Christiana proved that resistance could work, and that Northern juries might side not with federal law, but with justice. The event also exposed the deep hypocrisy of the Union. In theory, the Constitution bound North and South together. In practice, the Christiana Resistance revealed a nation split by irreconcilable values. When a Pennsylvania farmer could be charged with treason for refusing to help catch another human being, many Northerners asked, whose union was this? Whose laws did it serve? In the South, the story was retold as proof that secession was the only answer. If the North would not enforce slavery, then the South must leave the Union to preserve it. In the North, the story became part of a growing conviction that slavery's demands were intolerable, that a system which required ordinary citizens to become accomplices in bondage was a system that had no place in a free republic. By the 1850s, the Christiana Resistance was cited alongside other flashpoints: the rescue of Shadrach Minkins in Boston, 1851, the Oberlin-Wellington Rescue in Ohio, 1858, and countless smaller acts of defiance. Each one chipped away at the fragile compromises holding the Union together. Each one sharpened the line between freedom and slavery. For the black community of Christiana, the legacy was both inspiring and devastating. Families had been torn apart by arrests, exile, and fear. William Parker, the central figure of the resistance, never returned from Canada. Yet his courage, and the courage of his neighbors, became legend. In abolitionist meetings, Christiana was cited as proof that fugitives and free blacks would not submit quietly, that they were willing to fight and even die for liberty. In the decades after the Civil War, Christiana's story faded somewhat from the national spotlight, overshadowed by the larger drama of the war itself. Yet locally, in Lancaster County, it remained a point of pride among African Americans and their allies. Monuments and historical markers would eventually commemorate the clash, ensuring that the story of those who stood in defiance would not vanish entirely. Historians today see Christiana as more than just a violent clash on a September morning. It was a turning point, a moment when the contradictions of the Fugitive Slave Act became too stark to ignore. If the law demanded complicity in slavery, then law itself became the enemy of justice. Christiana revealed that the United States was heading toward a choice it could not avoid, to be a nation of freedom or a nation of chains. And perhaps most importantly, Christiana reminded the world that the enslaved were not passive. The black men and women who stood that morning were not waiting for white politicians to debate their fate. They claimed their own agency, their own right to resist, even at the risk of death. Their courage reverberated far beyond the fields of Pennsylvania, joining the chorus of resistance that stretched from Haiti to Harper's Ferry. In the end, Christiana was not just about one man's death or one community's defiance. It was about the fragile state of a nation built on compromise with injustice. It was about how ordinary people, with nothing but courage and desperation, could shake the foundations of an empire. And it was about memory, how the same event could be remembered as rebellion in one part of the country and as resistance in another. That division of memory mirrored the division of the nation itself, a division that would explode a decade later into the Civil War. Christiana was not the first confrontation over slavery, and it would not be the last. But in 1851, it became a signpost, a signal that the fragile peace between North and South was unraveling, and that the United States was already walking the road toward civil war. To understand Christiana's place in that road, we must see it alongside the chain of crises that defined the 1850s. The Fugitive Slave Act itself, passed just a year before the clash, was meant to calm sectional tensions. It was part of the Compromise of 1850, a grand bargain designed to balance the interests of slaveholding South and free North. California was admitted as a free state, and slavery was banned in Washington, D.C. But in exchange, the South demanded stronger guarantees that escaped slaves would be returned. The act gave slaveholders sweeping power. Federal marshals could compel any citizen to help capture fugitives, and refusal was punishable by fines or imprisonment. Accused fugitives were denied the right to testify in their own defense. In essence, the law transformed every northern street into an extension of the plantation, every free citizen into a potential slave catcher. Christiana revealed the impossibility of such a law. When Edward Gorsuch crossed into Pennsylvania with warrants in hand, he expected obedience. Instead, he met defiance, and the law collapsed under the weight of human resistance. The attempt to impose slavery on free soil had backfired, exposing the moral fault lines of the Union. After Christiana, other confrontations followed like falling dominoes. In Boston, the rescue of fugitive Shadrach Minkins, 1851, and the Anthony Burns case, 1854, turned the streets into battlegrounds between abolitionists and federal marshals. In Ohio, the Oberlin-Wellington Rescue, 1858, saw an entire town defy the law to protect a fugitive. Each of these events echoed Christiana's lesson: the North would not quietly comply. At the same time, the South saw these acts of resistance as proof that the Union no longer worked. If Northern juries would acquit, if Northern communities would rebel, then the guarantees of the Constitution were meaningless. Southern leaders increasingly spoke of secession, not as a last resort, but as an inevitable defense of their way of life. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 poured gasoline on the fire. By allowing settlers to decide for themselves whether new territories would permit slavery, it reopened questions the Compromise of 1820 had supposedly settled. Bleeding Kansas became a miniature civil war, with pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fighting in fields and towns. John Brown, who would later raid Harper's Ferry, first made his name here, wielding swords in the name of freedom. And behind every battle, the memory of Christiana lingered. Abolitionists pointed to it as a model of local resistance. Southerners pointed to it as a symbol of Northern treachery. Politicians debated it in speeches, preachers thundered about it from pulpits. The clash in one small Pennsylvania town became part of the national conversation about whether slavery and freedom could coexist in one republic. By the late 1850s, the answer was clear: they could not. In 1857, the Supreme Court delivered the Dred Scott decision, ruling that African Americans, free or enslaved, had no rights a white man was bound to respect. The decision further inflamed the North, convincing many that the entire system was stacked against liberty. Christiana's acquittals now seemed even more significant. If the highest court denied freedom, then only resistance could defend it. 2 years later, in 1859, John Brown launched his famous raid on Harper's Ferry. Brown hoped to spark a general uprising by seizing a federal armory and arming enslaved men across Virginia. Though the raid failed and Brown was executed, he became a martyr. In his courtroom speeches and final letters, he echoed the same conviction that had driven the defenders of Christiana, that slavery was a crime against humanity and that resistance was a duty, not a choice. By 1860, the United States stood on the brink. Abraham Lincoln's election convinced the South that the Union could no longer guarantee slavery. Secession followed, and by 1861, civil war engulfed the nation. Looking back, Christiana was not just a local skirmish. It was a foreshadowing. It showed how deeply ordinary people were willing to defy unjust laws. It showed how juries, courts, and communities were no longer united on the meaning of justice. It showed that the Fugitive Slave Act, The very law meant to preserve the Union was in fact tearing it apart. In this sense, Christiana belongs in the same lineage as Harper's Ferry, as Kansas, as Dred Scott. It was one more warning flare in a decade of crises, one more step down a road that could only end in war. For the men and women who stood that morning, it was not about history or politics. It was about survival, dignity, and the refusal to bow to chains. But in resisting, they became part of something larger than themselves. They became part of the story of how a nation learned, painfully, that compromise with injustice cannot last forever. When the smoke of the Civil War cleared and slavery was legally abolished in 1865, the Christiana Resistance of 1851 might have seemed like a small footnote in a vast national struggle. Hundreds of thousands had died, empires of cotton and tobacco had collapsed, and the United States had been remade in blood. Yet, Christiana never vanished. Instead, it lingered in memory, sometimes celebrated, sometimes suppressed, always contested. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Northern abolitionists pointed back to Christiana as proof of a long tradition of resistance. They argued that the defiance of William Parker and his neighbors foreshadowed the Union's eventual decision to fight slavery on the battlefield. Newspapers and speeches invoked Christiana as a moment when ordinary people had drawn a line and said no more. For Black communities, it became part of an underground heritage of courage, whispered to children and remembered in song. But in the South, the memory of Christiana took on a darker cast. For former slaveholders and pro-slavery politicians, it was remembered not as resistance, but as lawlessness, a tragic warning of what happened when Northern radicals encouraged defiance. In their retelling, Christiana was not about freedom, but about chaos, a symbol that abolition had always been dangerous and destructive. This distorted memory would persist into the era of Jim Crow, when Southern historians sought to minimize or demonize Black resistance. By the late 19th century, as the United States sought reconciliation between North and South, Christiana was often brushed aside. The dominant narrative of the Civil War became one of valor on both sides, of brother against brother. Stories that highlighted Black resistance, stories like Christiana, did not fit neatly into that picture. They were inconvenient reminders that the war had not only been about white soldiers, but about enslaved people claiming their own freedom. Yet locally, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the memory endured. Families who had lived through the clash passed down stories. Community elders pointed to the fields where blood had been spilled. For African American residents, Christiana was a source of pride, a reminder that their ancestors had stood unflinching against impossible odds. In the 20th century, historians began to recover the story more fully. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s sparked renewed interest in earlier moments of Black resistance. Christiana was rediscovered as part of a longer lineage, from Haiti to Harper's Ferry to Selma, of defiance against oppression. William Parker's own memoir, first published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1866, became a crucial source, giving voice to a man who had lived the resistance and refused to be forgotten. By the late 20th century, commemoration became more visible. In 1999, a state historical marker was erected near the site of the clash. The town of Christiana began hosting annual events to honor the resistance, drawing descendants, historians, and activists together. Plays and documentaries retold the story, often emphasizing its relevance to modern struggles for racial justice. Yet the memory remains contested. Some still call it the Christiana riot, echoing the language of 19th century newspapers that framed it as criminal violence. Others insist it should be called the Christiana Resistance, recognizing it not as chaos but as organized defiance of injustice. The very name reflects the deeper battle over how America remembers its past, as a story of rebellion against tyranny or as disorder that threatened the social order. In classrooms and textbooks, Christiana is still often overlooked. It lacks the scale of Nat Turner's rebellion, the drama of John Brown's raid, or the global impact of Haiti. But for those who know it, Christiana offers a vital lesson: that resistance does not always come in grand revolutions, but sometimes in small communities, in ordinary people refusing to submit. In today's America, the legacy of Christiana resonates more than ever. Questions of justice, resistance, and community solidarity remain urgent. The story of men and women standing together, black and white, free and fugitive, reminds us that change often begins with those who dare to act locally, even when the weight of the law is against them. William Parker himself lived the rest of his life in Canada, never returning to the United States. But his words, written in exile, carry a timeless message. We did not feel guilty, for we defended what was our own, our liberty, our lives, and the right to be free upon the soil where God had placed us. That sentiment transcends its moment. It speaks to every generation that faces injustice and wonders whether resistance is possible. Today, walking through Christiana, one finds not a battlefield, but quiet streets and fields. Yet beneath the surface, history lingers. A plaque here, a marker there, whispers the memory of that September morning. And in the minds of those who study it, Christiana is more than just a town. It is a symbol of how ordinary people, armed with nothing but courage, can challenge the strongest of chains. The Christiana Resistance reminds us of an essential truth, that freedom was never handed down from above. It was claimed, defended, and fought for from below. And though its story is not always told, it remains a beacon, proof that even in the face of overwhelming power, resistance is possible. History never sits quietly in the past. It ripples forward, shaping how we see ourselves, how we understand justice, and how we imagine the future. The Christiana Resistance of 1851 is one of those events whose meaning continues to evolve, interpreted, debated, and claimed by different generations. In the 19th century, Christiana was framed either as treason or as courage, depending on where one stood. In the 20th century, it was rediscovered as part of a longer tradition of African American resistance, and in the 21st century, it has become something more, a lens through which we can examine questions of law, justice, and community solidarity in our own time. A story retold in civil rights. During the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, activists searching for historical roots of black defiance found inspiration in Christiana. Here was a story of African Americans who did not simply escape or plead, but who fought back, directly, physically, and collectively. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. often preached nonviolence, but in grassroots movements across the South, communities also debated what self-defense meant. In that context, the Christiana story reminded people that resistance had many forms, and that even a century earlier, enslaved and free black people had chosen not to bow. Civil rights educators began weaving Christiana into lessons, particularly in northern states, to show that the struggle for freedom had not been confined to the South. Pennsylvania schoolchildren learned that freedom's fight was fought in their own backyards, not just in distant plantations. Academic reappraisals. Historians in recent decades have pushed for Christiana to be recognized as a pivotal moment in the history of American resistance. Scholars argue that calling it the Christiana riot obscures its true meaning, framing it as chaos instead of as organized, principled defiance. They prefer Christiana Resistance or even Christiana Rebellion, recentering the agency of those who fought for freedom. In academic circles, Christiana is often discussed alongside the Oberlin-Wellington Rescue, the Jerry Rescue in Syracuse, and John Brown's Raid, episodes where the line between law and justice broke wide open. Together, these events illustrate how the Fugitive Slave Act became not a stabilizer, but a destabilizer, pushing the nation closer to civil war. Echoes in today's movements. In today's America, the Christiana story carries striking resonance. Movements like Black Lives Matter and campaigns for criminal justice reform often invoke the long tradition of resistance against unjust laws. The logic is familiar. When the law itself enforces inequality, obedience is not virtue, it is complicity. Just as the Fugitive Slave Act criminalized compassion and demanded that ordinary citizens assist in oppression, modern activists see parallels in laws and systems that perpetuate racial injustice. Christiana reminds us that legality and morality are not always the same. What is legal may be profoundly unjust, and what is illegal may be deeply righteous. Community solidarity is another theme that resonates today. In Christiana, it was not just fugitives who resisted, it was neighbors, black and white, who stood together even when the risk was death or treason charges. In modern struggles, the same principle endures. Justice is strongest when communities refuse to let the vulnerable stand alone. Cultural representations. Christiana has also found a place in cultural memory. Plays, novels, and documentaries have retold the story, often emphasizing its cinematic qualities. The nighttime raid, the armed standoff, the sudden gunfire, and the dramatic trials. These retellings bring the story to new audiences, often reframing it not as a local curiosity, but as a national turning point. In some works, Christiana is portrayed as a precursor to the Civil War, in others, as an allegory for modern struggles. Artists emphasize the courage of William Parker, the resilience of his wife Eliza, and the defiance of the community. Their faces, often lost in the shadows of history, become symbols of a broader human struggle for dignity, memory, and silence. At the same time, Christiana challenges us to ask why some stories are remembered and others are forgotten. Why is Christiana not as well known as Harper's Ferry or the Underground Railroad? Why do monuments celebrate generals but not farmers who dared to resist? Part of the answer lies in the politics of memory. Telling the story of Christiana means confronting uncomfortable truths, that law can be unjust, that freedom was won not only by statesmen but by armed resistance, and that ordinary citizens once stood against their own government in the name of liberty. For some, those truths remain too radical, even today. Lessons for the present. Christiana offers several enduring lessons. Justice is not always legal. The law of 1851 demanded obedience to slavery. The resistors of Christiana showed that morality may demand defiance. Resistance is collective. No one at Christiana could have resisted alone. It was the strength of the community, men, women, fugitives, and free, that made defiance possible. Memory is power. How we remember the past shapes how we act in the present. Calling Christiana a riot diminishes its meaning. Calling it resistance restores dignity. Fear reveals fragility. The fact that one small clash could terrify an empire shows that systems built on injustice are always vulnerable. In the end, the Christiana Resistance is more than a story about 1851. It is a story about now. It asks us, what do we do when the law itself is unjust? How far will we go to defend freedom? And will we remember those who dared, even when history tries to forget them? The people of Christiana could not have known that their defiance would echo into centuries, but it does, and in their courage we find not just history, but a mirror. The fields of Christiana are quiet now. No gunsmoke drifts through the air, no shouts echo across the hills. The farmhouse where the clash unfolded stands as just another piece of the Pennsylvania countryside. But if you listen closely, history still whispers here. It whispers of men and women who refused to bow, who risked everything to defend their families, their dignity, and their freedom. The Christiana Resistance was not the largest battle of the slavery era. It was not the bloodiest, nor the most famous. But it was a turning point. It showed that slavery could not be enforced without resistance. It proved that ordinary people, farmers, fugitives, mothers, and neighbors, could stand together and defy an empire. And it revealed a truth that echoed across the decade to come, that a nation built on chains could not hold forever. But memory is fragile. Stories like Christiana are too often buried, overshadowed by grander narratives of generals and politicians. If we forget these moments of defiance, we lose sight of the truth, that freedom was not granted by law, but seized by courage. That every victory against slavery was built on the bravery of those who chose to resist, even when the odds were impossible. And that is why we tell these stories here. Because history is not just the past, it is the mirror in which we see ourselves. When we remember Christiana, we are reminded that injustice can be resisted. That community can stand against oppression, that even when the law says obey, conscience can still say no. So if this story moved you, if it made you feel the weight of history pressing into the present, don't let it fade here. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next untold chapter of slavery's dark past. Share this video so others can learn how deeply resistance shaped the world we live in today. Leave a comment with your reflections. Your voice keeps the dialogue alive, just as the memory of Christiana has survived through whispers and stories. Together, we can make sure that these voices, the voices of William Parker, Eliza Parker, the fugitives, the neighbors, the community that chose to resist, are not forgotten. Together, we can honor their courage by carrying their memory forward. The Christiana Resistance was one night in 1851, but its meaning endures. It asks us, even now, what would you do if the law demanded you betray your conscience? What would you risk to defend freedom? The past still speaks. The question is, are we willing to listen?